The server room at NATO's Cyber Defense Center hummed with the sound of 1,000 machines, processing terabytes of classified data. But all Marcus Chen could hear was the snickering behind him. The pink mechanical keyboard clicked rhythmically. As Zara Petrov typed, her rose-gold headphones gleaming under the fluorescent lights, completely oblivious to the mockery spreading through the room like a virus. "Look at Barbie over there," whispered Lieutenant Davidson to his colleague, nodding toward the small figure hunched over her workstation. "Did she get lost on her way to a gaming convention?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But when the screen started flashing red at 0347 hours, when every satellite in the European theater went dark simultaneously, when the words "system compromised" appeared across every monitor in 12 different languages, nobody was laughing anymore. Because the girl with the pink gear was already typing faster than anyone thought humanly possible, her fingers dancing across those ridiculous keys like she was conducting a digital orchestra. And in the next 6 hours she would do something that would make every person in that room realize they had been sitting next to a legend they never bothered to recognize. The Brussels headquarters of NATO's Cyber Defense Center occupied 17 floors of a glass and steel monument to international cooperation, its facade reflecting the gray October sky like a mirror designed to hide secrets. Inside the building, thrummed with the constant pulse of global surveillance, threat assessment, and digital warfare that most civilians never knew existed. The third sublevel, officially designated as Data Processing Center C, was where the real work happened. No windows, no natural light, just rows upon rows of workstations arranged in precise geometric patterns, each one a command post in humanity's ongoing war against digital chaos. Zara Petrov had been assigned to Workstation 47, tucked into a corner between the emergency exit and a humming stack of backup servers that generated enough heat to make the space feel perpetually tropical. She didn't mind the location. Corner positions offered better sight lines, fewer blind spots, and the kind of strategic advantages that most people associated with military tactics rather than office seating arrangements. At 24, she possessed the kind of technical brilliance that made seasoned cybersecurity experts feel like children playing with toy computers, but her appearance suggested someone who had wandered into the wrong building entirely. Her setup was impossible to ignore, a riot of pink and rose gold hardware that stood out against the standard issue black and gray, equipment like a flamingo in a flock of crows. The keyboard was a custom mechanical masterpiece, each key backlit in soft pink that pulsed gently as she typed. Her mouse matched perfectly, its ergonomic curves designed for marathon coding sessions that could stretch 18 hours without a break. The headphones were professional-grade audio equipment wrapped in rose-gold metal that caught the light every time she turned her head. Even her multiple monitors were framed in sleek pink bezels that somehow managed to look both playful and sophisticated. She had built every piece of her workstation herself, selecting components not just for their aesthetic appeal, but for their performance capabilities that exceeded anything the standard NATO procurement process could provide. The keyboard responded to her touch with mechanical precision that allowed her to type at speeds that approached 140 words per minute with zero errors. The mouse tracked movement at resolutions that could detect the slightest tremor, essential for the kind of precision work that involved navigating through hostile network architectures where a single misclick could trigger security protocols that would slam digital doors shut forever. Most of her colleagues assumed the pink equipment was some kind of statement, a rebellion against the serious masculine atmosphere of military cybersecurity, or perhaps an attempt to inject personality into an environment that discouraged individual expression. They were wrong on both counts. Zara had chosen pink for the same reason fighter pilots painted their aircraft in distinctive colors during World War II, recognition, and psychological warfare. When enemy hackers encountered her distinctive signature in their networks, when they realized they were facing the operator with the pink gear, she wanted them to know exactly who was dismantling their carefully constructed digital fortresses. But nobody at NATO knew about her reputation in certain circles. They saw a young woman from Bulgaria who had somehow managed to score a position in one of the world's most exclusive cybersecurity units despite having what appeared to be a childish obsession with unconventional equipment colors. Her personnel file listed her qualifications in dry technical language that failed to capture the true scope of her capabilities. Master's degree in computer science from Sofia University, additional certification in advanced network security from MIT, 3 years experience in private sector cybersecurity consulting. Clean background check, no criminal record, fluent in 7 languages including Russian and Mandarin. What the file didn't mention was that she had been reverse engineering malware since she was 15, that she had discovered 3 zero-day exploits in major operating systems before she turned 20, or that she had spent her teenage years in underground hacking forums where her handle, pink_phantom, had become synonymous with operations so sophisticated that intelligence agencies around the world kept classified dossiers trying to determine her real identity. She had transitioned from the gray areas of ethical hacking to legitimate cybersecurity work, not because she had been caught or reformed, but because she had grown bored with challenges that didn't involve protecting something that mattered. Her first day at NATO had been a masterclass in institutional prejudice disguised as professional skepticism. Marcus Chen, the unit's senior analyst, had introduced her to the team with the kind of enthusiasm typically reserved for announcing budget cuts or mandatory overtime policies. She had been assigned to third shift monitoring duties, the cybersecurity equivalent of being asked to watch paint dry, while more senior analysts handled the interesting cases during prime hours. The message was clear: prove yourself worthy of real responsibility by demonstrating that you could handle mundane tasks without causing problems. Zara had accepted the assignment without complaint, understanding that every organization had its hierarchies and initiation rituals. She set up her distinctive workstation, ignored the whispered comments and barely concealed smirks from colleagues who clearly questioned her technical competence, based on her equipment choices, and settled into the rhythm of overnight surveillance. Her job involved monitoring automated threat detection systems, responding to low-level intrusion attempts, and generating reports that would be reviewed by more senior analysts during the day shift. For 3 weeks, she had performed these duties flawlessly, her reports models of technical precision and strategic insight that impressed even the most skeptical supervisors. She arrived precisely on time, worked without breaks, and maintained the kind of quiet professional demeanor that suggested serious dedication to the mission. But her colleagues remained unconvinced. The pink equipment continued to generate comments that ranged from gentle teasing to barely disguised contempt, as if her choice to customize her workspace somehow indicated fundamental unseriousness about the grave responsibilities of international cybersecurity. Lieutenant Davidson, a former Army intelligence officer who had transitioned to NATO cybersecurity after 2 deployments in Afghanistan, seemed particularly bothered by her presence. He possessed the kind of rigid military bearing that extended to his opinions about appropriate workplace behavior, and Zara's colorful equipment violated his sense of institutional decorum. During team briefings, he would make comments about the importance of maintaining professional standards and projecting appropriate seriousness to visiting officials who expected NATO personnel to embody military discipline. His colleague, Senior Analyst Jennifer Walsh, shared these concerns but expressed them more diplomatically, suggesting during informal conversations that perhaps Zara might consider adopting more conventional equipment choices that would better reflect the gravity of their mission. Walsh had spent 8 years climbing the ranks of military cybersecurity, earning respect through demonstrated competence and careful attention to the unwritten rules that governed advancement in hierarchical organizations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She viewed Zara's unconventional choices as either naive or deliberately provocative, neither of which suggested the kind of strategic thinking required for success in high-stakes environments. The rest of the team maintained polite but distant relationships with the newcomer, uncertain how to interpret someone who seemed technically competent but made choices that suggested either ignorance of institutional culture or deliberate rejection of it. During shift changes, conversations would halt when she entered break rooms, resume in whispers after she left. She became the subject of speculation and gentle mockery, the kind of workplace gossip that develops around anyone who fails to conform to established norms. Zara understood the dynamics perfectly, but chose not to engage with them directly. She had experienced similar situations in previous jobs, academic settings, and social environments where her combination of technical expertise and unconventional presentation created cognitive dissonance in people who expected certain correlations between appearance and capability. She had learned long ago that attempting to justify her choices or prove her competence through verbal arguments was less effective than simply demonstrating superior performance when opportunities arose. The opportunity she had been waiting for arrived at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning in late October, when every screen and data processing center simultaneously erupted in cascading alerts that transformed the normally quiet overnight shift into controlled chaos. The first indication of trouble came from the satellite monitoring stations, where automated systems detected unusual signal patterns from 3 different orbital platforms responsible for European communications relay. Within seconds, those unusual patterns evolved into complete signal loss, followed immediately by similar failures across the entire constellation of NATO surveillance satellites covering Eastern European airspace. Marcus Chen arrived at his workstation to find 47 different alarm notifications demanding immediate attention, each one representing a critical system failure that under normal circumstances would require hours of investigation and remediation. The automated threat detection algorithms were generating reports faster than human operators could process them, creating a digital avalanche of warnings that threatened to overwhelm the center's response capabilities. Emergency protocols activated automatically, sealing the building's external communications and summoning senior leadership from their homes across Brussels. Within 15 minutes, the overnight shift had been reinforced by every available analyst within driving distance of headquarters, transforming the normally spacious work environment into a cramped crisis center where senior officials huddled around workstations trying to understand the scope of the disaster unfolding across their screens. General Morrison, NATO's Director of Cyber Operations, arrived in civilian clothes with his hair still disheveled from sleep, demanding immediate briefings on what intelligence services were already classifying as the most serious cyber attack in the Alliance's history. The satellite network that had gone dark represented decades of technological development and billions of dollars in infrastructure designed to provide early warning capabilities against potential Russian or Chinese military movements. These orbital platforms monitored everything from troop concentrations along contested borders to the electromagnetic signatures of missile defense systems that could indicate preparation for hostile action. Their simultaneous failure created a blind spot in NATO's defensive capabilities that enemy forces could exploit for strategic advantage during the critical hours required to restore functionality. Initial diagnostic efforts revealed the sophisticated nature of the attack, which had penetrated multiple layers of security through what appeared to be a coordinated assault on fundamental system architectures rather than opportunistic exploitation of individual vulnerabilities. The hostile actors had somehow gained access to core satellite control protocols, administrative credentials that should have been impossible to compromise, and backup systems that were supposed to activate automatically when primary networks failed. They had demonstrated technical capabilities that exceeded the assessed abilities of most nation-state cyber warfare units. As senior analysts worked frantically to assess damage and begin restoration procedures, Zara continued monitoring her. Assigned systems with the same methodical attention she had maintained during routine overnight shifts. Her screen showed the same cascade of alerts that were overwhelming her colleagues, but she approached the crisis with systematic precision, rather than the barely controlled panic that was beginning to affect other team members. While others focused on immediate damage assessment, she began tracing the attack vectors that had enabled such comprehensive system penetration. Her pink keyboard clicked steadily as she navigated through network logs that most analysts would have found incomprehensible, following digital breadcrumbs that revealed the elegant architecture of the assault. The attackers had used advanced persistent threat techniques, establishing footholds in seemingly unrelated systems months earlier, and then activating coordinated strikes that exploited the interconnected nature of modern satellite networks. They had demonstrated patience and planning that suggested state-level resources, combined with technical sophistication that exceeded anything in NATO's threat assessment databases. But Zara recognized something in the attack patterns that her colleagues had missed. The intrusion techniques bore signatures that she had encountered before, during her years navigating underground hacking communities where the most advanced practitioners shared knowledge and techniques that wouldn't appear in academic literature for years. She had seen similar approaches used by groups that specialized in infiltrating air-gapped systems, networks that were supposed to be completely isolated from external access. The satellite attacks weren't just sophisticated. They were specifically designed by people who understood the psychological and technical weaknesses of the institutions they were targeting. As the crisis deepened and senior officials began discussing the possibility of requesting emergency assistance from allied intelligence agencies, Zara made a decision that would fundamentally alter not just her own career trajectory, but NATO's understanding of the threats they faced in an interconnected world. She opened a secure communication channel to her workstation and began typing commands that would have seemed like gibberish to most of her colleagues but represented years of accumulated knowledge about network architectures that existed in conveying the spaces between official systems and underground communities. Her fingers moved across the pink keys with increasing speed as she initiated countermeasures that drew on techniques she had learned during late-night sessions in forums where hackers shared knowledge about defeating the kind of advanced security measures that protected critical infrastructure. She was preparing to demonstrate capabilities that would reveal not just her true expertise, but the inadequacy of conventional approaches to defending against adversaries who understood that the most dangerous attacks came not from outside organizational boundaries but from the spaces where official systems intersected with the broader digital ecosystem. The next few hours would determine whether NATO's most critical surveillance capabilities could be restored before enemy forces recognized the scope of their temporary advantage. But more importantly, they would reveal whether the alliance's cybersecurity establishment was ready to accept help from someone whose pink equipment and unconventional background had marked her as unsuitable for serious responsibility in their carefully structured world of military protocol and institutional hierarchy. The first breakthrough came 47 minutes after the initial attack, when Zara's unconventional approach began yielding results that the standard NATO response protocols had failed to achieve. While her colleagues continued running diagnostic subroutines that had been designed for conventional intrusion scenarios, she had identified 17 different entry points that the attackers had used to establish their foothold in the satellite control network. Each entry point revealed a different aspect of the assault's architecture, painting a picture of coordination and technical sophistication that far exceeded anything in NATO's existing threat assessment databases. Her pink monitors displayed cascading lines of code that would have appeared like digital hieroglyphics to most observers, but Zara read them with the fluency of someone who had spent years learning to think like the adversary she now faced. The attackers had used a technique called living off the land, exploiting legitimate system administration tools in ways that avoided triggering conventional security alerts. They had gained initial access through a vulnerability in a third-party software update that had been pushed to satellite ground stations 6 months earlier, then remained dormant while conducting reconnaissance that mapped every aspect of NATO's orbital surveillance architecture. The patience demonstrated by this approach suggested state-level resources and strategic planning that treated the satellite network not as an isolated target, but as one component of a larger campaign designed to create strategic blind spots during periods of heightened international tension. Intelligence reports that Zara accessed through her security clearance indicated unusual military exercises along multiple NATO borders, suggesting that the satellite attack might be intended to mask preparation for more serious hostile actions. That would require the alliance to respond without its most sophisticated early warning capabilities. But understanding the attack's strategic purpose was less important than stopping it before the damage became irreversible. The hostile actors had not simply disabled the satellites. They had introduced malicious code into the core control systems. That was designed to spread throughout the network like a digital virus, corrupting backup systems and recovery protocols that were supposed to enable rapid restoration of functionality. Every minute of delay increased the possibility that the entire constellation would suffer permanent damage, requiring months or years to rebuild. Zara's fingers moved across her keyboard with mechanical precision as she began implementing countermeasures that drew on techniques she had learned during her years in underground hacking communities. These were not approaches that appeared in any official cybersecurity manual or NATO training program, but rather methods that had been developed by practitioners who operated in the gray spaces between legitimate security research and criminal activity. She was essentially fighting fire with fire, using the same unconventional tactics that the attackers had employed, but turning them toward defensive rather than offensive purposes. Her first priority was establishing secure communication channels with the compromised satellites, which required bypassing the corrupted control systems that the attackers were using to maintain their foothold in the network. She created what hackers called a shadow infrastructure, a parallel set of communication pathways that existed alongside the official systems, but remained invisible to the malicious code that was monitoring and disrupting normal operations. This required intimate knowledge of satellite communication protocols that went far beyond what she should have possessed based on her official training and security clearance level. Marcus Chen noticed her unusual activity when routine monitoring software detected that her workstation was generating network traffic patterns that didn't match any standard NATO operational procedures. Under normal circumstances, such anomalous behavior would have triggered immediate security alerts and possibly resulted in her access being suspended pending investigation. But the ongoing crisis had overwhelmed most automated monitoring systems, and Chun was too focused on coordinating the broader response effort to investigate individual workstation irregularities that weren't directly interfering with restoration efforts. 20 minutes later, Zara achieved something that the senior analysts had deemed impossible under current circumstances. She established direct communication with satellite Bravo 7, one of the orbital platforms that had been completely dark since the initial attack. The connection was tenuous and intermittent, requiring constant manual adjustments to compensate for the malicious interference that continued to disrupt normal communication protocols. But it provided the first real-time intelligence about conditions aboard the compromised satellites that NATO had received since the crisis began. The data she retrieved painted a disturbing picture of the attack's sophistication and current scope. The hostile actors had not simply gained unauthorized access to satellite control systems. They had essentially taken over administrative functions and were using NATO's own orbital platforms to conduct surveillance and intelligence, gathering operations that violated multiple international treaties. The satellites were being repositioned to monitor NATO military installations, communication centers, and strategic infrastructure, while simultaneously denying the alliance access to their own surveillance capabilities. More troubling was evidence that the attackers were preparing for the next phase of their operation, which appeared to involve using the compromised satellites to disrupt civilian communication and navigation systems across Europe. The malicious code included subroutines designed to interfere with GPS signals, cellular networks, and internet infrastructure that millions of people depended on for everything from banking transactions to emergency services coordination. What had begun as a military cyber attack was evolving into an assault on civilian infrastructure that could cause widespread chaos and potentially thousands of casualties. Zara immediately escalated her findings to Marcus Chen, who was coordinating response efforts from a workstation surrounded by senior officials and liaison officers from multiple intelligence agencies. Her report cut through the controlled chaos of the crisis center like a digital alarm bell, providing the first comprehensive intelligence about the attacker's current capabilities and apparent intentions. Within minutes, her analysis was being transmitted to emergency coordination centers in Washington, London, and Berlin, where senior policymakers were trying to formulate appropriate responses to what appeared to be an unprecedented attack on critical infrastructure. But sharing intelligence about the threat was different from actually stopping it, and conventional NATO cybersecurity protocols were proving inadequate for dealing with adversaries who operated outside the assumptions that had shaped alliance defense planning. The standard response to sophisticated cyber attacks involved isolating compromised systems, analyzing attack vectors, and implementing patches or updates that closed identified vulnerabilities. These approaches worked well against opportunistic criminals or even moderately sophisticated state actors, but they were too slow and rigid for dealing with adversaries who adapted their tactics in real time and had already anticipated most conventional countermeasures. General Morrison arrived at Zara's workstation 37 minutes after her initial intelligence report, accompanied by a small group of senior officials whose expressions suggested they were grappling with scenarios that exceeded their existing contingency plans. Morrison was a career military officer who had spent decades rising through the ranks of conventional armed forces before transitioning to cybersecurity leadership, and his approach to digital warfare retained the hierarchical decision-making structures that had served him well in traditional military contexts. He looked uncomfortable surrounded by the banks of monitors and high-tech equipment that defined modern cyber operations centers. The general studied Zara's analysis with the kind of methodical attention that suggested he was translating technical information into strategic implications that would inform decisions about resource allocation and response priorities. Her findings indicated that NATO was facing not just a cybersecurity incident, but a coordinated assault on critical infrastructure that could escalate into broader military conflict if not addressed within hours rather than days. The compromised satellites were already being repositioned to monitor NATO defensive preparations, providing the attackers with intelligence that could be used to plan follow-up operations or coordinate with other hostile activities. Morrison's questions revealed both his strategic acumen and his limited technical background, focusing on operational implications rather than the specific methods Zara had used to gather her intelligence. He wanted to understand timelines for potential civilian impact, the scope of military capabilities that might be compromised, and the likelihood that the attack represented preparation for broader hostile actions that would require NATO to implement Article 5 collective defense protocols. These were the kinds of strategic considerations that shaped alliance decision-making at the highest levels. But as Morrison and his staff focused on policy implications, other members of the crisis response team were beginning to notice that Zara's technical capabilities appeared to exceed what should have been possible based on her official qualifications and security clearance level. Lieutenant Davidson, who had been monitoring her workstation activity as part of his role coordinating junior analyst assignments, observed that her network traffic patterns suggested access to communication channels and data sources that weren't included in standard NATO cybersecurity toolkits. Davidson's suspicions were shared by several other senior analysts who had begun questioning how a relatively new team member was achieving results that more experienced personnel had been unable to replicate using established procedures. During brief conversations conducted in hushed tones near coffee stations and supply closets, they speculated about whether Zara might have unofficial technical resources or knowledge that she hadn't disclosed during her background investigation. In high-security environments where everyone's activities were monitored and documented, unusual competence could generate as much suspicion as obvious incompetence. These concerns reached a tipping point when senior analyst Jennifer Walsh discovered that Zara had somehow gained access to classified satellite communication logs that were supposed to be available only to personnel with higher security clearances than her official file indicated she possessed. Walsh had been cross-referencing intelligence sources to verify Zara's findings when she noticed data references that pointed to information repositories that were compartmentalized beyond her supposed authorization level. Either there had been a serious error in the security clearance process, or Zara was using unofficial methods to access classified information. Walsh immediately reported her concerns to Marcus Chen, who was already struggling to balance the operational demands of the ongoing crisis with the administrative responsibilities of supervising a diverse team of analysts under unprecedented pressure. Chen found himself in the uncomfortable position of needing Zara's technical expertise to address the satellite crisis while simultaneously needing to investigate whether she might be violating security protocols in ways that could compromise the entire operation. The timing could not have been worse, with NATO leadership demanding immediate results and enemy actors continuing to expand their control over critical infrastructure. The investigation that followed revealed aspects of Zara's background that had not appeared in her official personnel file, despite the comprehensive background checks that were supposed to precede assignment to sensitive positions. Chen's inquiries with human resources and security departments uncovered references to sealed juvenile records, educational transcripts that included coursework in advanced computer science topics that weren't offered at her listed institutions, and employment gaps that hadn't been adequately explained during her hiring process. More troubling were indications that she had been the subject of previous intelligence community interest, though the specific nature of that interest remained classified at levels beyond Chen's access. As these investigations proceeded, Zara continued working on the satellite crisis with the same methodical focus she had maintained throughout her assignment to NATO. She seemed either unaware of the scrutiny her activities had generated or determined to prioritize the immediate threat over concerns about her own career prospects. Her workstation continued displaying the kind of technical activity that suggested intimate familiarity with systems and protocols that exceeded her supposed expertise, but she responded to questions about her methods with explanations that were technically accurate while avoiding details about how she had acquired such sophisticated knowledge. The breakthrough that would ultimately vindicate her unconventional approach came at 0647 hours, when her persistent efforts to establish communication with additional satellites finally succeeded in contacting satellite Delta III, which had been dark for over 3 hours and was carrying some of NATO's most sensitive surveillance equipment. The connection revealed that the attackers had been using the satellite's advanced imaging capabilities to conduct detailed reconnaissance of military installations across Eastern Europe, generating intelligence that could be used to plan coordinated strikes against NATO defensive positions. More immediately concerning was evidence that the hostile actors were preparing to use Delta III's communication relay capabilities to broadcast false emergency warnings that could trigger panic evacuations. In major European cities, the malicious code included pre-programmed messages in 12 different languages warning of imminent terrorist attacks, nuclear incidents, and other catastrophic events that would cause millions of people to flee their homes and overwhelm emergency response systems. This represented an escalation from military cyber attack to psychological warfare directed against civilian populations. Zara's discovery of this planned escalation prompted immediate emergency communications with NATO leadership and member nation governments, who recognized that they were facing a threat that extended far beyond military cybersecurity into the realm of public safety and social stability. The potential for mass civilian casualties from panic-induced evacuations and infrastructure failures required response protocols that involve not just military and intelligence agencies, but civil defense organizations, emergency services, and public health authorities across multiple countries. But stopping the broadcast attack required more than just identifying the threat. It demanded technical capabilities that could neutralize the malicious code before it could execute its programmed instructions. Conventional cybersecurity approaches would require hours or days of careful analysis and testing before implementing countermeasures, time that NATO didn't have if civilian populations were going to be protected from psychological warfare attacks that could begin at any moment. The situation demanded the kind of rapid, unconventional response that official protocols were not designed to support. Zara recognized that her unofficial expertise might be NATO's only hope for preventing civilian casualties, but using her full capabilities would require revealing knowledge and techniques that would inevitably raise questions about her background and potentially compromise her security clearance. She faced a choice between maintaining her carefully constructed official identity and demonstrating the skills that had made her legendary in certain underground communities, but would mark her as a security risk in the institutional environment where she now worked. The decision was ultimately made for her when automated monitoring systems detected that the hostile actors had begun the final preparation sequence for their psychological warfare attack. Satellite Delta III was being repositioned to optimize broadcast coverage of major population centers, and the malicious code was conducting final system checks before executing the coordinated emergency message campaign. NATO had less than 90 minutes to prevent an attack that could cause more civilian casualties than most conventional military operations, and standard cybersecurity procedures offered no realistic possibility of success within such compressed timeframes. Zara's pink keyboard began clicking with a rhythm that suggested she had moved beyond conventional technical procedures into the realm of digital improvisation that required real-time adaptation to rapidly changing conditions. Her monitors displayed command sequences that bore no resemblance to standard NATO cybersecurity protocols, drawing instead on techniques that had been developed by practitioners who operated in environments where failure meant immediate detection and potential prosecution. She was essentially conducting cyber warfare using methods that official institutions preferred to pretend didn't exist. Her approach required not just technical skill, but psychological insight into the adversary she was fighting, understanding their probable responses to various countermeasures and anticipating the adaptive strategies they would employ when their primary attack vectors were neutralized. This was the kind of sophisticated adversarial thinking that had made her reputation in underground communities, where the most advanced practitioners competed against each other in digital environments that simulated real-world cyber war scenarios. She was drawing on years of experience fighting the kind of sophisticated opponents who would eventually graduate to attacking critical infrastructure for nation-state actors. As Zara worked to prevent the civilian psychological warfare attack, other members of the crisis response team continued their investigations into her background and methods, creating a parallel drama that would ultimately determine whether her technical success would be celebrated or result in her prosecution for security violations. The institutional tensions between operational effectiveness and procedural compliance were reaching a breaking point, with NATO's most critical cybersecurity crisis being resolved by someone whose methods appeared to violate the same security protocols that were supposed to protect the alliance from hostile actors. The next hour would determine not just whether millions of European civilians would be subjected to coordinated psychological warfare attacks, but whether NATO's cybersecurity establishment was capable of adapting its institutional culture to accommodate the kind of unconventional expertise that modern digital threats required. Zara's pink equipment continued to stand out against the standard-issue gray and black workstations around her, a visual reminder that the most effective responses to sophisticated threats might come from sources that challenged institutional assumptions about appropriate professional behavior and technical capabilities. The transformation began at 0729 hours, when Zara made the decision that would define not just her own future, but NATO's understanding of what modern cybersecurity defense required. She stopped pretending to work within conventional protocols and unleashed the full scope of capabilities that had made her a legend in digital communities that most of her colleagues didn't know existed. Her pink keyboard became a weapon of unprecedented precision as she initiated a counterattack that would be studied in classified military academies for decades to come. The first indication that something fundamental had changed came when every screen in Data Processing Center C suddenly displayed synchronized readouts showing real-time satellite positions, communication frequencies, and malicious code execution. Timelines that should have been impossible to access through standard NATO systems. Zara had somehow gained administrative control over monitoring networks that were supposed to be air-gapped from regular workstations, creating a comprehensive battlefield awareness display that revealed the full scope of the ongoing attack with clarity that left senior analysts speechless. Her monitor showed a three-dimensional representation of the entire European satellite constellation, with each compromised platform highlighted in red and displaying detailed information about the malicious activities being conducted through its systems. Hostile actors were using 17 different satellites to monitor military installations, conduct surveillance of civilian infrastructure, and prepare for the coordinated psychological warfare attack that was scheduled to begin in less than 40 minutes. The visualization made clear that this was not just a cybersecurity incident, but a comprehensive assault on European stability that had been planned with military precision. But understanding the threat was only the beginning. Zara's real expertise lay in her ability to think like the adversaries she faced, anticipating their responses to countermeasures and staying several steps ahead of adaptive strategies that would have neutralized conventional defensive approaches. She had spent years in underground communities where the most sophisticated practitioners tested their skills against each other in digital environments that simulated real-world cyber war scenarios, developing an intuitive understanding of adversarial psychology that no formal training program could provide. Her counterattack began with a technique that hackers called social engineering at the code level, exploiting the psychological assumptions that the hostile actors had built into their malicious software. She had identified patterns in their attack architecture that revealed not just technical capabilities, but cognitive biases and operational preferences that could be manipulated to turn their own weapons against them. The attackers had designed their systems to be adaptive and self-protecting, but those same characteristics made them vulnerable to deception techniques that could convince their malicious code to execute unintended instructions. Marcus Chen realized that something extraordinary was happening when his workstation began receiving data feeds that provided more comprehensive intelligence about the satellite attack than anything NATO's cybersecurity division had produced in the previous 4 hours. The information was arriving through communication channels that he didn't recognize, formatted in ways that suggested intimate knowledge of NATO operational protocols, while simultaneously bypassing every security restriction that should have prevented such access. He found himself torn between professional amazement at the technical achievement and growing concern about the security implications of Zara's apparent capabilities. The psychological warfare prevention that followed demonstrated why Zara's reputation in certain circles had transcended normal hacking community boundaries and entered the realm of digital mythology. She didn't just neutralize the malicious code that was preparing to broadcast false emergency warnings across European population centers. She turned the attackers' own communication systems into a trap that would identify their command and control infrastructure while simultaneously feeding them false information about NATO defensive preparations. Her approach required simultaneous manipulation of 17 different satellite communication systems, each with its own security protocols and operational characteristics, while maintaining the deception that her activities were part of the normal system recovery process rather than an active counterattack. She was essentially conducting cyber warfare in real time while making it appear that the compromised systems were simply experiencing routine technical difficulties that would be resolved through standard maintenance procedures. The technical complexity of this operation exceeded anything that most cybersecurity professionals would have considered possible, requiring not just programming expertise, but real-time adaptation to changing conditions as the hostile actors attempted to diagnose and counter her activities. She was fighting a digital chess match against adversaries who possessed state-level resources and years of preparation time, using nothing but her workstation and knowledge that had been acquired through unofficial channels that would have horrified NATO security officers if they had understood its true scope. Lieutenant Davidson was the first to recognize that Zara's activities had moved far beyond anything that could be explained by conventional technical training or standard-issue NATO cybersecurity tools. His monitoring of network traffic patterns revealed that her workstation was generating command sequences that appeared to be directly interfacing with satellite control systems that were supposed to be accessible only through specialized secure terminals that required additional security clearances and physical authentication protocols. Either there had been a catastrophic failure in NATO's security architecture, or Zara was using capabilities that weren't included in any official technical manual. Davidson's concerns escalated into full alarm when he realized that Zara was not just accessing restricted systems, but actively modifying their configurations in ways that would normally require approval from multiple levels of command, authority, and extensive testing to ensure that changes wouldn't compromise operational integrity. She was essentially rewriting critical infrastructure software in real time while engaged in active combat with hostile actors who were simultaneously attempting to prevent her modifications and adapt their own attack strategies to counter her evolving defensive measures. But as Davidson prepared to initiate security protocols that would have suspended Zara's access pending investigation, General Morrison appeared at his workstation with an expression that suggested he had been monitoring the situation from command levels that operated according to different priorities than standard security compliance procedures. Morrison had been receiving real-time intelligence briefings that revealed the true scope of the civilian threat that NATO was facing, and he understood that conventional procedures were inadequate for addressing an attack that could cause mass casualties within minutes rather than hours. The general's decision to allow Zara to continue her unconventional counterattack represented a fundamental shift in NATO's approach to cybersecurity crisis management, acknowledging that modern digital warfare required capabilities and methods that challenged traditional institutional boundaries between legitimate security operations and the underground communities where the most advanced techniques were developed. Morrison was essentially authorizing the use of hacking techniques that official NATO policy preferred to pretend didn't exist, recognizing that bureaucratic purity was less important than protecting civilian populations from psychological warfare. Attacks. This authorization came at 0751 hours, just as Zara's counterattack reached its most critical phase. She had successfully infiltrated the attackers' command and control infrastructure, gaining access to communication networks that revealed the full scope of their operation while simultaneously feeding them false intelligence about NATO's defensive capabilities and response timelines. The hostile actors believed they were maintaining operational security while actually providing Zara with comprehensive intelligence about their organizational structure, technical capabilities, and strategic objectives. Her monitors displayed real-time communications between attack coordinators in 3 different countries, revealing that the satellite operation was just one component of a larger campaign designed to create cascading failures in European infrastructure. During a period when political tensions were already elevated due to ongoing diplomatic disputes, the psychological warfare attack was intended to trigger mass civilian evacuations that would overwhelm emergency response systems and create opportunities for follow-up operations targeting transportation networks, power grids, and communication systems that would be stressed beyond capacity by refugee movements. But more immediately concerning was intelligence indicating that the hostile actors had detected anomalies in their satellite control systems and were preparing to implement emergency protocols that would cause permanent damage to the orbital platforms rather than allowing NATO to regain control of critical surveillance capabilities. They were essentially preparing to destroy billions of dollars of infrastructure to prevent their operation from being completely neutralized, accepting the loss of their primary attack vectors in exchange for denying NATO the strategic intelligence capabilities that those satellites provided. Zara recognized that she had minutes rather than hours to complete her counterattack before the hostile actors implemented destructive protocols that would turn tactical victory into strategic disaster for NATO's long-term defensive capabilities. She began implementing what hackers called a scorched earth reversal, using the attackers' own destructive capabilities against their command and control infrastructure while simultaneously protecting the satellite systems from the damage they were preparing to inflict. This phase of the operation required her to essentially become 3 different digital entities simultaneously, maintaining her infiltration of hostile networks while protecting NATO satellites from destruction and coordinating with legitimate system administrators who were still attempting to implement conventional recovery procedures. She was conducting cyber warfare at a level of complexity that pushed both her technical capabilities and her understanding of adversarial psychology to their absolute limits. The breakthrough came when she successfully convinced the attackers malicious code that their command and control servers were actually NATO systems that needed to be destroyed to protect the integrity of their operation. Their own destructive protocols began targeting their infrastructure while leaving the satellite systems intact, creating a cascade of failures that unraveled their entire attack architecture within 17 minutes. The hostile actors found themselves fighting their own weapons while losing control of the systems. They had spent months infiltrating and preparing for coordinated assault. Senior analyst Jennifer Walsh watched this digital battlefield unfold with growing amazement and professional horror, recognizing that she was witnessing capabilities that exceeded anything in her extensive cybersecurity background while simultaneously violating virtually every security protocol that governed NATO operations. Zara was achieving results that would have required teams of specialists working for weeks with access to resources that didn't exist in any official inventory, using methods that appeared to draw on knowledge sources that raised fundamental questions about her background and potential security risks. But Walsh's concerns about security compliance were overshadowed by her growing recognition that NATO was witnessing the emergence of cybersecurity capabilities that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in digital warfare. If Zara's techniques could be understood, documented, and integrated into official operational procedures, the Alliance would possess defensive and offensive cyber capabilities that exceeded anything that hostile nation-states had demonstrated. The question was whether institutional culture could adapt quickly enough to accommodate expertise that challenged fundamental assumptions about appropriate professional behavior and technical competence. The final phase of Zara's counterattack began at 0823 hours, when she initiated what would later be classified as the most sophisticated cyber warfare operation in NATO history. Having gained complete control over the attackers' infrastructure and neutralized their ability to cause permanent damage to satellite systems, she began using their own networks to trace the operation back to its ultimate sources, identifying not just the immediate perpetrators, but the state-level sponsors and institutional supporters who had provided resources and strategic direction for the attack. Her digital forensics revealed a complex web of relationships between official intelligence agencies, private military contractors, and criminal organizations that had collaborated to create plausible deniability for what was essentially an act of war disguised as cyber-criminal activity. The attack had been designed to appear as though it had originated from non-state actors, allowing the sponsoring nation to avoid direct accountability while achieving strategic objectives that would have required conventional military action to accomplish through traditional means. But Zara's investigation went beyond simply identifying the attackers. She began collecting comprehensive intelligence about their other operations, ongoing campaigns, and future plans that revealed the satellite attack as part of a systematic effort to degrade NATO defensive capabilities in preparation for more serious hostile actions. Her infiltration of their networks provided access to strategic planning documents, operational schedules, and resource allocation decisions that offered unprecedented insight into enemy capabilities and intentions. This intelligence coup transformed what had begun as a defensive cybersecurity operation into an offensive intelligence gathering campaign that would provide NATO with strategic advantages for years to come. Zara had not just neutralized an immediate threat, but had essentially turned the entire hostile operation into an intelligence source that would continue providing valuable information about enemy activities long after the satellite crisis had been resolved. The scope of her achievement began to dawn on senior NATO leadership as intelligence reports started flowing through command channels, providing insights into hostile capabilities and strategic planning that exceeded anything the Alliance had obtained through conventional intelligence operations. General Morrison found himself reviewing documents that revealed enemy preparations for coordinated attacks on multiple fronts, identification of sleeper agents positioned within European infrastructure organizations, and detailed assessments of NATO defensive weaknesses that had been compiled through years of systematic reconnaissance. But the most significant revelation came when Zara's digital archaeology uncovered evidence that the hostile actors had been planning similar attacks on civilian infrastructure in North America and Asia, suggesting that the European satellite operation was a proof of concept for global campaigns designed to destabilize international security architecture through coordinated cyber war operations. NATO wasn't just facing an isolated attack on regional capabilities, but was confronting the initial phase of a comprehensive assault on the technological foundations of modern civilization. This intelligence prompted immediate emergency communications with allied governments and international organizations, as policymakers recognized that they were dealing with threats that transcended traditional concepts of national security and required unprecedented levels of international cooperation. The satellite attack had revealed vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure that could be exploited by any adversary with sufficient technical capabilities and strategic patience to conduct operations that unfolded over months or years rather than hours or days. As news of Zara's success spread through NATO command structures, the institutional response revealed deep tensions between operational effectiveness and bureaucratic compliance that would define cybersecurity policy for years to come. Her technical achievements were unprecedented and strategically invaluable, but her methods had violated virtually every security protocol that governed legitimate military operations. She had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything in official NATO arsenals while using techniques that raised fundamental questions about the sources of her expertise and the security implications of employing personnel whose backgrounds included unauthorized access to advanced hacking knowledge. Lieutenant Davidson found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to investigate someone whose actions had potentially saved millions of civilian lives while simultaneously violating security regulations that existed to protect NATO from exactly the kind of insider threats that her capabilities suggested she might represent. The standard response to her security violations would have been immediate suspension and criminal investigation, but her operational success made such actions politically and strategically impossible for an organization that needed her expertise to defend against future attacks. The resolution came when General Morrison made a command decision that reflected both pragmatic strategic thinking and institutional evolution in response to changing threat environments. Rather than treating Zara's unconventional capabilities as security violations, NATO would officially recognize them as specialized expertise that required new categories of security, clearance, and operational authority. She would be transferred to a newly created position that provided the institutional flexibility needed to employ her unique skills while maintaining the security oversight required to ensure that her activities served NATO's strategic objectives. But the most dramatic moment came at 0956 hours when Zara completed her counterattack and began shutting down the digital infiltration systems she had used to neutralize the hostile operation. As her workstation returned to normal operational parameters, she turned to address the crowd of senior officials, intelligence analysts, and cybersecurity specialists who had gathered to witness the conclusion of the most significant cyber war operation in NATO history. Her first words were not about her technical achievements or the strategic intelligence she had gathered, but about the 17 NATO service members whose lives had been saved by the early warning intelligence that the restored satellite systems would now be able to provide. She had identified hostile preparations for a coordinated missile attack on a NATO installation in Eastern Europe that was scheduled to begin within hours, using the communications disruption caused by the satellite attack as cover for conventional military operations that would have caused significant casualties if not detected in advance. The operational impact of her success extended far beyond the immediate crisis resolution. NATO's cybersecurity establishment would spend months analyzing her techniques and attempting to integrate her approaches into official defensive protocols. Her methods would influence training programs, resource allocation decisions, and strategic planning processes that would shape alliance cybersecurity capabilities for decades. She had not just solved a tactical problem, but had demonstrated possibilities for cyber defense that would revolutionize institutional thinking about digital warfare. But perhaps the most significant change was in the attitudes of her colleagues, who had moved from skepticism and ridicule to professional respect and genuine amazement at capabilities that exceeded their previous understanding of what individual technical expertise could accomplish. Her pink equipment no longer seemed like frivolous personal expression, but rather like the distinctive tools of someone who operated at levels of technical sophistication that required specialized equipment optimized for performance rather than conventional appearance. Marcus Chen approached her workstation as she completed her final system diagnostics, carrying a security briefing folder that contained her new assignment details and the enhanced clearance authorizations that would govern her future work. The institutional recognition of her unique capabilities represented not just personal career advancement, but acknowledgement that NATO's cybersecurity establishment needed to evolve beyond traditional concepts of appropriate professional behavior and technical competence. Her new position would involve leading a specialized team responsible for defending against the kind of sophisticated cyber threats that required unconventional responses and expertise that drew on knowledge sources that official institutions preferred not to acknowledge. She would have the authority to recruit personnel from underground hacking communities, develop techniques that challenged traditional security protocols, and operate with the kind of institutional flexibility that modern digital warfare required. As Zara gathered her personal equipment and prepared to transition to her new role, Senior Analyst Jennifer Walsh offered an apology that reflected the broader institutional soul-searching that her success had prompted. The ridicule and skepticism that had greeted her distinctive equipment choices and unconventional background represented not just personal prejudice, but systemic blind spots that prevented organizations from recognizing and utilizing expertise that didn't conform to traditional expectations about professional competence and appropriate behavior. The final moments of the crisis came when satellite communications were fully restored and NATO commanders received confirmation that the hostile missile attack on Eastern European installations had been successfully interdicted based on intelligence that Zara's counterattack had provided. The coordination between cybersecurity operations and conventional military responses demonstrated the kind of integrated defense capabilities that would define 21st century warfare, where digital and physical operations were so interconnected that success in one domain required expertise in all others. But the personal transformation was perhaps more significant than the institutional changes. Zara had moved from being an underestimated newcomer subjected to workplace ridicule to becoming a recognized expert whose capabilities would influence NATO strategy for years to come. Her pink equipment would become a symbol not of frivolous personal expression, but of the kind of individual excellence that could emerge from sources that challenged conventional expectations about professional competence. The story concluded with Zara's workstation displaying the restored satellite feeds that showed peaceful European cities continuing their normal activities, unaware that they had been hours away from coordinated psychological warfare attacks that could have caused mass casualties and social chaos. Her success had prevented not just immediate civilian harm, but had protected the technological infrastructure that modern civilization depended on for everything from financial transactions to emergency services coordination. General Morrison's final assessment, which would be classified at the highest levels of NATO intelligence, concluded that the satellite crisis had revealed both the vulnerabilities and the defensive possibilities of modern cyber warfare. Hostile actors with state-level resources could conduct sophisticated attacks that threatened critical infrastructure and civilian populations, but defensive capabilities existed that could not just neutralize such threats, but turn them into sources of strategic intelligence that would provide long-term advantages for the defenders. The most important lesson, however, was that these defensive capabilities might exist in individuals whose backgrounds and presentation challenged institutional assumptions about appropriate professional behavior and technical competence. NATO's ability to defend against future cyber threats would depend not just on technological resources and conventional expertise, but on institutional flexibility that could recognize and utilize excellence regardless of the sources from which it emerged. As Zara powered down her pink equipment and prepared for her new responsibilities, the data processing center returned to its normal quiet efficiency, but with the understanding that the most significant cybersecurity achievements might come from personnel who brought unconventional perspectives and capabilities to challenges that exceeded the scope of traditional training and established procedures. Her success had demonstrated that effective cyber defense required not just technical knowledge, but the kind of creative problem-solving and adversarial thinking that could emerge from any source willing to challenge conventional approaches to complex problems. The weeks following Zara's unprecedented counterattack brought changes to NATO's cyber defense center that extended far beyond personnel assignments and organizational charts. The institutional transformation began with physical modifications to Data Processing Center C, where her distinctive pink workstation had become something of a pilgrimage site for visiting cybersecurity experts who wanted to examine the equipment that had been used to conduct the most sophisticated cyber defense operation in military history. The standard issue gray and black aesthetic that had dominated the facility for years was gradually giving way to a more diverse array of personalized workstations as management recognized that individual expression might correlate with technical innovation in ways that previous policies had failed to appreciate. Marcus Chen found himself navigating the complex politics of an organization that was simultaneously celebrating Zara's success while grappling with the implications of techniques that challenged fundamental assumptions about appropriate cybersecurity methodology. His role as unit supervisor had evolved into something resembling cultural translation, helping senior leadership understand why effective cyber defense might require personnel whose backgrounds and approaches differed significantly from traditional military cybersecurity specialists. The conversations were often uncomfortable, forcing career officers to acknowledge that their institutional expertise might be inadequate for addressing threats that emerged from the same underground communities where the most advanced defensive techniques were being developed. The intelligence gathered during Zara's counterattack continued yielding valuable insights months after the initial crisis, as NATO analysts worked through terabytes of data that revealed the scope and sophistication of hostile cyber operations that had been targeting Alliance infrastructure for years without detection. The enemy networks that Zara had infiltrated contained communications dating back over 18 months, documenting systematic reconnaissance of European power grids, transportation systems, financial networks, and communication infrastructure. That suggested preparations for coordinated attacks that would have made the satellite operation appear modest in comparison. But perhaps more troubling were indications that similar reconnaissance had been conducted against civilian infrastructure in North America and Asia, suggesting that NATO had uncovered evidence of global cyber warfare preparations that transcended traditional concepts of regional security threats. The hostile actors had been conducting patient, methodical intelligence-gathering operations that mapped critical vulnerabilities in the technological foundations of modern civilization, creating the capability to cause widespread disruption of services that billions of people depended on, for everything from medical care to food distribution. These discoveries prompted emergency consultations with allied governments and international organizations as policymakers recognized that cyber warfare had evolved beyond traditional military targets to encompass civilian infrastructure in ways that could cause mass casualties without conventional weapons. The strategic implications were staggering, suggesting that future conflicts might be decided not by military superiority, but by the ability to protect and exploit the digital systems that supported modern society's basic functions. General Morrison spent considerable time briefing senior NATO leadership on the organizational changes that would be required to defend against threats that operated at the intersection of military strategy, criminal activity, and technological innovation. The traditional boundaries between different types of security expertise were proving inadequate for addressing adversaries who combined state-level resources with underground hacking techniques and criminal network operational security. NATO needed cybersecurity capabilities that could operate in the same gray areas where their opponents had demonstrated such devastating effectiveness. The solution involved creating what became known as the Advanced Cyber Defense Initiative, a specialized unit that would recruit personnel from unconventional backgrounds and employ techniques that challenged traditional institutional boundaries. Between legitimate security operations and the underground communities where cutting-edge cyber capabilities were developed, Zara's success had demonstrated that effective defense required not just technical knowledge, but the kind of adversarial thinking and creative problem-solving that emerged from environments where practitioners competed against each other in digital battlefields that simulated real-world cyber warfare scenarios. The recruitment process for this new unit proved more complex than anyone had anticipated, as NATO discovered that the most capable cybersecurity practitioners often possessed backgrounds that raised questions about security clearance eligibility, while simultaneously demonstrating exactly the kind of expertise that modern cyber defense required. The tension between institutional security requirements and operational effectiveness forced fundamental reconsiderations of personnel policies that had been designed for more conventional threats and enemy capabilities. Lieutenant Davidson found himself assigned to the challenging task of developing security protocols that could accommodate personnel whose technical capabilities exceeded standard clearance categories while maintaining the oversight necessary to ensure that their activities served NATO's strategic objectives rather than personal or external agendas. The work required creating new frameworks for evaluating individuals whose expertise had been acquired through unofficial channels that included exposure to techniques and communities that traditional security assessments were designed to exclude. But the most significant changes occurred in NATO's approach to international cybersecurity cooperation. As the intelligence gathered during Zara's counterattack revealed the truly global scope of the threats that individual nations were facing. The hostile cyber operations that had targeted European satellites were coordinated with similar activities in other regions, suggesting that effective defense required unprecedented levels of information sharing and coordinated response capabilities that transcended traditional concepts of national sovereignty in cyberspace. These realizations prompted intensive diplomatic efforts to establish international cybersecurity cooperation frameworks that could coordinate defensive operations across national boundaries while respecting the political and legal constraints that governed different countries' approaches to cyber warfare. The technical challenges were matched by political complexities, as governments struggled to balance the operational requirements of effective cyber defense with domestic security concerns and international legal obligations that had been developed for more conventional threats. Senior analyst Jennifer Walsh became deeply involved in these international coordination efforts, using her experience analyzing Zara's unconventional techniques to help other nations understand the capabilities and methods that modern cyber defense required. Her work involved translating technical innovations into policy frameworks that could accommodate the kind of institutional flexibility that had enabled NATO's success while maintaining the accountability and oversight that democratic governments required for military and intelligence operations. But the personal dimensions of the transformation were equally significant, as NATO personnel who had initially viewed Zara's pink equipment and unconventional background with skepticism found themselves reconsidering fundamental assumptions about the sources from which technical excellence could emerge. The workplace culture that had previously emphasized conformity to established norms was gradually evolving to recognize that individual differences in presentation and methodology might indicate precisely the kind of creative thinking that complex problems required. This cultural shift extended beyond cybersecurity to influence other aspects of NATO operations as leadership recognized that modern military challenges increasingly required interdisciplinary expertise and unconventional approaches that challenged traditional institutional boundaries. The success of someone who had been initially dismissed based on appearance and equipment choices provided a powerful example of the dangers of institutional prejudice and the importance of evaluating personnel based on capabilities rather than conformity to established expectations. The technical innovations that Zara had demonstrated during the satellite crisis became the foundation for new cybersecurity training programs that attempted to teach conventional military personnel some of the adversarial thinking and creative problem-solving techniques that had made her counterattacks so effective. But the programs revealed fundamental differences between knowledge that could be taught through formal instruction and the kind of intuitive understanding that emerged from years of experience in competitive underground communities where practitioners tested their skills against sophisticated opponents. These training challenges prompted deeper questions about how military institutions could develop the kind of unconventional expertise that modern threats required without compromising the discipline and accountability that effective military operations demanded. The balance between encouraging individual creativity and maintaining institutional cohesion became a central concern for military educators, who recognized that future conflicts would require capabilities that challenged traditional approaches to personnel development and organizational culture. The broader implications extended beyond NATO to influence cybersecurity thinking in government agencies, private sector organizations, and academic institutions that were grappling with similar challenges in identifying and utilizing unconventional expertise. Zara's success had demonstrated that the most capable practitioners might not emerge from traditional educational and career pathways, creating pressures for institutional reforms that could recognize and accommodate excellence regardless of its sources or presentation. But perhaps the most profound changes occurred in public understanding of cybersecurity threats and the capabilities required to address them, as declassified versions of the satellite crisis began appearing in academic literature and policy. Discussions that shaped public awareness of cyber warfare realities. The story of how someone initially dismissed as frivolous had prevented a coordinated attack on civilian infrastructure became a powerful example of the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize competence and dedication. The international cybersecurity community began developing new approaches to identifying and cultivating talent that drew on lessons learned from Zara's success, recognizing that effective cyber defense required diverse perspectives and unconventional thinking that might not conform to traditional professional expectations. Conferences and academic programs started emphasizing the importance of cognitive diversity and creative problem-solving in ways that challenged established assumptions about appropriate cybersecurity education and career development. These changes reflected broader social recognition that modern technological challenges required expertise that could emerge from any source willing to develop the knowledge and skills that complex problems demanded. The traditional boundaries between legitimate and underground technical communities were becoming less relevant as organizations recognized that effective innovation often occurred in spaces where conventional rules and expectations were challenged by practitioners who approached problems from unconventional perspectives. The story of Zara's pink equipment and her transformation from ridiculed newcomer to recognized expert became a case study in management literature and organizational psychology research that examined how institutional prejudices could prevent organizations from recognizing and utilizing available expertise. Her success provided empirical evidence for theoretical arguments about the importance of cognitive diversity and the dangers of conformity pressures that could exclude valuable perspectives and capabilities. As months passed and the Advanced Cyber Defense Initiative began operations with personnel recruited from increasingly diverse backgrounds, NATO's cybersecurity capabilities evolved in directions that would have been impossible under previous institutional constraints. The unit's success in preventing subsequent cyber attacks and gathering intelligence about hostile operations validated the organizational changes that Zara's initial success had prompted, demonstrating that effective modern military operations required institutional flexibility that could accommodate unconventional approaches and personnel. The final assessment of the satellite crisis and its aftermath concluded that NATO had not just prevented a significant attack on critical infrastructure, but had discovered defensive capabilities that fundamentally altered the strategic balance in cyber warfare. The techniques and approaches that had emerged from underground hacking communities proved applicable to legitimate military operations in ways that provided substantial advantages over adversaries who continued operating within more conventional frameworks. But the most important lesson was recognition that institutional excellence required organizational cultures that could identify and support exceptional capabilities regardless of their sources or presentation. Zara's paint equipment had become a symbol not of inappropriate frivolity, but of the individual expression and creative thinking that modern challenges required, demonstrating that effective organizations needed to look beyond surface appearances, to recognize the competence and dedication that could emerge from any source willing to develop the expertise that complex problems demanded. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.